Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my channel, Fluent Pro Hub.
Learn English like a child.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's a guide, basically, that says ditch the textbooks, forget all those old methods and learn the way kids do.
Hmm.
So I think this will be a really fun one to dig into. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm excited to dive in. It definitely challenges how we usually think about learning a language. I mean, most people, when they think about learning a language, they think about like grammar books and memorizing vocabulary. But this guide argues that it's more about connection and communication, like how children learn.
Yeah, it's like we get so stuck in those rules.
Yeah.
I remember feeling so overwhelmed when I started learning English, all those verb tenses and like, oh my gosh.
Right.
But this guide, it points out that, even before kids can understand what you're saying, their brains are like little sponges just soaking up everything.
It's pretty amazing, right? Like they're picking up these patterns and meanings even before they can even speak.
It's wild. It's like they're little detectives of language.
Totally. And the guide, it compares their brains to sponges, just absorbing all this information around them. So it's that constant exposure that helps them learn, even if they don't get it right away.
So then how do we, like, as adults, recreate that kind of environment, especially if we're not living in, like, an English-speaking country?
Well, the guide, it says that living in an English-speaking country, that's obviously ideal, but there are other things we can do. You can actually create a similar experience wherever you are.
Oh, that's awesome. So what are those things?
Well, it gives like a three-step approach. So the first one, it's kind of intense, but it says dedicate a few days to consuming only English content.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, like go all in. Movies, podcasts, books, music, everything.
Like a language boot camp kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly. And even if you don't understand every single word, the idea is just to like completely immerse yourself.
That sounds pretty challenging, though, especially if you, like, have a busy schedule.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It definitely takes some commitment. But even if you can just do a few hours each day, that's already a huge step. Just try to increase your exposure as much as you can.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's step one. What about step two? What's the next thing?
Okay, so this one might sound a little strange.
Okay.
It's talking to yourself in English.
What?
Yeah, like describe your day, practice sentences, or even just like have imaginary conversations. Just anything to get those language muscles working.
I mean, I can see how that would feel kind of awkward at first.
Oh, yeah, definitely. But the guide emphasizes that it's a great way to practice without worrying about making mistakes.
Yeah.
Like nobody's judging you. It's just you.
That's true, yeah. It's like having a built-in English tutor.
Yeah, exactly. Available 24/7.
Yeah.
And the best part is you can focus on whatever you need to work on. Like if there's a specific grammar point you're struggling with or you just want to improve your pronunciation, you can really tailor it to your own needs.
That's cool. Okay, so we've got like the full immersion thing and then the talking to yourself thing. What's the third step?
The third step is all about connecting with other English speakers online. Like, there's so many groups and forums and social media platforms that are specifically for language learning.
Right.
So it's a great way to find people to practice with. And it's really supportive environment. You don't have to be afraid of making mistakes.
Yeah.
And you can even make new friends from all over the world.
That's awesome. It's like creating that social element that kids have naturally.
Exactly. And the internet makes it so easy to connect with people no matter where you are.
I love that. Okay, so we've covered the immersion part, but what about the actual learning process? Like, kids don't sit down with grammar books.
Right.
So how do they actually learn all the nuances of the language?
Well, that's where this idea of observation and imitation comes in. So kids are incredibly observant. They learn by watching and copying the people around them. And it's not just about the words, it's also about the facial expressions, the gestures, even the tone of voice.
So it's more about getting a feel for the language than just memorizing rules.
Yeah, exactly. It's about picking up on all those subtle things that make language come alive. And the guide, it encourages us to try and do the same thing. Like instead of getting caught up in all the technical details, just focus on how native speakers actually use the language.
That's really interesting. But how can we, like, become more observant? Do we, like, start eavesdropping on conversations?
Well, not necessarily eavesdropping, but the guide does suggest being more mindful of the language you encounter in movies and TV shows, even in everyday conversations. Like pay attention to how words are pronounced, how sentences are structured, how body language adds to the meaning.
So it's like actively engaging with the language instead of just passively listening.
Exactly. And the more you observe and absorb, the more natural your own English will become.
I like that. Okay, so the guide also gives some specific techniques for becoming a better observer, right? What are some of those?
So one technique is mimicking. Like, try repeating phrases and sentences from movies or conversations you hear.
Okay.
And really pay attention to everything, the pronunciation, the intonation, even the facial expressions. It might feel a little silly at first,
Right.
but it's a great way to really internalize the nuances of how English is spoken.
It reminds me of how actors prepare for roles. Like they really immerse themselves in the characters' mannerisms and speech patterns.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy. And the guide also emphasizes the importance of practice, especially speaking practice. Don't be afraid to talk to yourself, record yourself, even practice in front of a mirror. Just get those words out there.
So it's about pushing past that fear of making mistakes and just experimenting with the language, like kids do.
Exactly. And speaking of mistakes, that brings us to another really important point that the guide highlights. The guide, it really encourages us to kind of change the way we think about mistakes. It says that they're not like this big scary thing, They're actually like stepping stones to fluency.
Okay.
It points out that kids, when they're learning to speak, they aren't afraid of making mistakes. They just try things out, they experiment, and through that process, they gradually get better.
Oh, that's so true. Yeah, they just sort of like instinctively get it,
Right, exactly. And the guide says that we should try to adopt that same kind of mindset. Like instead of getting all worried about saying the wrong thing, we should look at those mistakes as opportunities to learn and improve.
That's so much easier said than done, though, right? I mean, it's hard to just like switch off that fear of making mistakes.
Oh, I know, for sure. It definitely takes some effort.
Yeah.
But the guide gives some good advice on how to do that. Like one thing it suggests is to focus more on just communicating your message, even if your grammar isn't perfect or your pronunciation isn't spot on.
I like that. It's like taking the pressure off a bit and just focusing on the joy of actually using the language.
Yeah, exactly. And the more you practice speaking, the more comfortable you'll become, even if you make a few mistakes along the way. It's all part of the process.
Yeah, it's like trusting that your brain will eventually figure it out, just like it did when you were a kid.
Right, exactly. And that kind of leads us to another really interesting thing about how kids learn languages, which the guide talks about.
Okay.
It's about thinking in English.
Ah, yes. The whole like not translating in your head thing.
Yeah, exactly. The guide points out that kids, they don't translate things in their heads. They just think directly in the language they're learning.
Right.
And it suggests that adults can actually develop that ability too.
Wow, but that sounds like really hard. How do you even begin to do that? Like to rewire your brain to think in a different language?
Well, the guide gives some practical tips. One thing it says is to start by naming things around you in English, like without translating from your native language.
So like if I see a table, instead of thinking mesa, I would think table.
Yes, exactly. It's about training your brain to make those direct connections between the object and the English word.
And I guess over time that becomes more and more automatic, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The guide emphasizes that consistency is key. The more you practice thinking in English, even if it's just little things here and there, the more natural it will become.
So it's like building a mental muscle.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. You're strengthening those pathways in your brain that connect your thoughts directly to English words.
I like that analogy. Okay, so naming objects is one thing, but the guide also talks about incorporating English into your daily routine, even in your thoughts, right?
Yes, exactly. It suggests trying to describe your daily activities in English, even if you're just doing it in your head. Like, for example, when you're getting ready in the morning, you might think, I'm brushing my teeth, or I'm getting dressed, things like that.
So it's like creating a constant internal monologue in English.
Yeah, exactly. And the guide argues that this kind of mental practice can really help to reinforce your English skills and make the language feel more natural.
It's almost like immersing yourself in the language from the inside out.
I like that. That's a great way to describe it. But, we've talked a lot about theory and techniques.
Right.
What about actually putting all of this into practice in the real world?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's one thing to like understand the concepts, but it's another to actually use the language.
Right. And that's where the guide's final emphasis comes in, which is real-life practice. It highlights a really interesting difference between how children and adults approach language learning. Like, kids are totally fearless when it comes to using their language skills, even if they're not perfect.
It's so true.
But adults, we often hesitate to speak because we're afraid of making mistakes or being judged.
Yeah, that fear can be really paralyzing.
Exactly. And the guide suggests that we can overcome that fear by taking a page from children's book and just diving in, just start speaking.
But how do we do that? Like, what are some practical ways to get that real-life practice?
Well, the guide suggests starting with small things like greeting people in English, or ordering food at a restaurant, or asking for directions.
Those seem like such small things.
I know, but they can actually make a big difference.
Okay.
Because they help you to build confidence and create a sense of momentum. And as you get more comfortable, you can gradually increase the complexity of your interactions. Maybe you join an English conversation group or even travel to an English-speaking country.
The guide also mentions online communities, right? Like as a way to get real-life practice.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah.
Online communities can be so valuable, especially for people who don't have a lot of opportunities to speak English in their everyday lives.
Yeah, they can be super helpful.
Yeah, they offer like a safe space to practice.
Yeah.
And you can connect with other people who are learning just like you and get feedback and support and stuff.
And make some friends along the way.
Exactly. It's like building your own little English-speaking community.
I love that. And what's interesting is that the guide even mentions the possibility of having like live online practice sessions.
Oh, yeah?
Where you can interact with other learners in real time, almost like a virtual classroom kind of thing.
That's cool. I like that idea.
Yeah. And it made me think about how even the guide itself, like, it mentions this potential live practice session and even encourages people to leave a comment if they're interested. It's almost like a little nudge,
Yeah.
to put all this advice into action, not just on your own, but together with other learners.
That's a great point. It's
Yeah.
like they're saying, hey, don't just read about it. Go out and actually do it,
Yeah, exactly. And it really highlights that idea of taking initiative. I mean, think about how kids learn. They're constantly seeking out opportunities to use their language skills. They don't wait for permission. They just dive in.
So true.
Yeah.
And the guide kind of reinforces that idea that we should be actively looking for these opportunities, whether it's online or in person, just creating our own little language playgrounds.
I love that analogy. And it doesn't have to be anything fancy or complicated, just small steps.
Yeah.
Even just talking to one other person in English can make a huge difference.
Totally. And it's not just about the speaking practice either. It's also about the community aspect. Kids, they learn and grow within their social circles, and we can do the same thing by connecting with other learners, sharing experiences, supporting each other. It all makes a big difference.
Absolutely. So, to wrap things up for you, our listener, what's the takeaway here? Well, it's pretty simple, really. It's time to rediscover the joy of learning English, Ditch those old ideas about rules and perfection and embrace the natural, intuitive approach that kids use so effortlessly.
And don't be afraid to put yourself out there. Find opportunities to practice, connect with other learners, create your own little language learning adventure.
Exactly. Remember, the guide has given us a fantastic roadmap, but the real journey starts when you take that first step, when you believe in yourself and your ability to learn and grow.
And who knows, maybe along the way you'll even inspire others to do the same.
That would be awesome. So keep those language fires burning. And remember, the world of English is waiting to be explored. We'll be back next week with another deep dive. Until then, keep learning, keep growing, and keep those conversations flowing.